Today I want to appeal to United Nations and Western rationalists and Western religious leaders. United Nations and Western rationalists recommend usually material wealth or ephemeral wealth. For Jesus, they are curses like affluence, comfort, consumption, and rich economies. So, on the other hand, they should be recommending eternal wealth or blessings according to Jesus, such as poverty, hunger, weeping, and suffering to their own civilizations. Actually, Jesus says, "Woe to the rich, all the things what we recommend, United Nations, Western religions, all the Western nations, what we recommend, affluence, happiness." But Jesus says, "Woe to you those who are happy, woe to you those who are eating full, woe to them when people praise you, your economy, woe to you, all the affluent people, see curses. But the blessings, blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are the weeping, blessed are the suffering." These things they would never recommend. The Western rationalists believe Jesus Christ, but they never recommend these things. Usually, they recommend only curses like affluence and comfort and what Jesus calls them curses. That is what they've been recommending to the 7 billion people on this planet. And they create a global monoculture. These people, they want to see their own lifestyle as the standard practice. So they think that is the ultimate price and culture, and everybody should follow it. All the 7 million people should follow it. So that is the thing, what is going on. And this insistence on global monoculture, a mistaken priority of the material wealth. It has led our civilization to collapse. Choosing to live by eternal wealth, that is, the indigenous cultures, they practice sustainable development has enabled them to flourish. E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful points out a society suffering from spiritual poverty yet considering itself as a wealthy is an ultimate delusion. In this regard, Western society perhaps can never be a role model to the rest of the world to be followed. If one does, ultimately, it will lead to misunderstanding and ecocide. The capitalist development paradigm permits the minority of the world's people to enjoy wealth and luxury, but only by forcing others into dehumanizing poverty, creating unjust inequalities between rich and poor, and destroying the environment in the process. Since the West is the most preferred model of emulation for the rest of the world, they have a moral obligation to set a good example that will lead to the well-being of the planet and sustainable development, not scandalizing other cultures and other 7 billion people. Jesus Christ warns scandal in these words. Woe to him through whom scandal comes. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he should offend one of these little ones. Luke chapter 7, verse 1 to 2. The rich industrial countries of the West plus Japan may just voluntarily create their own reduction and consumption and show a shining demonstration. They can do that, such demonstration. Jesus Christ applauds. You are light of the world. The initiative will enable them to decarbonize their own societies so successfully that they create a shining example for the rest of the world, which will ultimately feel compelled to copy the example in order to attain the same level of prosperity and energy dependence to the rest of the world. If they demonstrate in a credible way, then it will become something like an infectious disease. I'm sure the developing nations such as India, China, Brazil, and rest of the world will happily copy that. But it would all depend on the success of the shining demonstration. Rest of the world would value the moral, religious, cultural, and political choices if made by the West. Let us not forget that this relationship is built on trust. Unfortunately, the affluent societies of today make such exorbitant demands on the world's resources, create ecological dangers of such intensity, and produce such a high level of neurosis amongst their populations that they cannot possibly serve as a model to be imitated by those 2/3 or 3/4 of humankind who are conventionally considered underdeveloped or developing. If all the rest of the world's people attained a Western standard of living or pursuing a global monoculture, we would need 3 to 4 planets. I don't have any hatred toward global monoculture if it is based on moral and ethical values such as equity, equality, solidarity, forgiveness, conservation, freedom, and universal brotherhood. Global monoculture of sustainable living that seems to be the good news should be promoted and evangelized, not the capitalistic ideals of production and consumption. Global monoculture models recommended by United Nations and Western religions and rationalists are based on a unilinear view of cultural development, which assumes the developing countries should eventually catch up with the developed countries in terms of material affluence. This view contends that people should give up their traditional cultures and modernize, taking developed countries such as United States and Japan as the model. It further assumes in a spirit reminiscent of old imperialist concepts that since developed countries are rich and technologically superior, that have a moral obligation to help countries which are poor and technologically backward. The globalization of the economy represents a form of cultural imperialism on a global scale, whereas the older forms of imperialism attempted to impose Western values on non-Westerners. The newer form attempts to impose first world values on non-first worlders. Ecological economists contend that since current rates of economic growth are clearly unsustainable over the long term, it is impossible for everyone in the world to enjoy ever rising levels of material affluence. That is not possible. We cannot, moreover, rely on technological advances to save us. In the 1972 book, The Limits to the Growth, researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Boston, demonstrated through computer simulations that even if we could double the present energy supply, recycle 75% of other resources, reduce pollution to one-fourth its present level, double agricultural production, and make effective means of birth control universally available, economic collapse within the next century could not be avoided. An update of the limits to growth published in 1992 largely confirmed the results of the earlier study, but argued that present levels of economic growth have already pushed us beyond the limits of ecological sustainability. The creation of a global market based on free trade ultimately serves the interest of first and third world elites more than it does the interest of non-elites. Multinational corporations frequently close down factories in developed countries and reopen them in developing countries to take advantage of low taxes, lax environmental regulations, and cheap labor. Corporate profits skyrocket at the same time that thousands of first world workers lose their jobs and tax revenues for social services are cut. While business elites in the third world also profit from such ventures, third world workers are often forced to endure working conditions similar to those described in the novels of Charles Dickens. The combination of exploitative working conditions and global free trade policies leads to competitive pressure, which also drives down wages and benefits in first world countries. Workers in both the north, the rich, and the south, the poor, are engaged in what has been described as a race to the bottom. The poor, of course, often do not have enough money to buy even essential goods. At present, the richest fifth of the world's population receives approximately 82.7% of the world's wealth, while the poorest fifth receives only 1.4%. Much of the discrepancy can be blamed on increased globalization. The economies of many developing countries now depend on exporting natural resources, agricultural products, and manufactured goods to developed countries. In other words, the poor are not extracting resources, growing food, or making products for themselves, but rather for the benefit of people in developed countries. In export-driven economies, imbalances are created in which the siphoning of the labor and goods from developing countries to developed countries leaves the poor with insufficient resources to meet their own basic needs. It is not difficult to see why developed countries, which make up only about one-fourth of the Earth's population, consume about three-fourths of the Earth's resources at a rate per capita that is 15 times that of most people living in the developing countries. Therefore, United Nations, Western religions, and Western rationalism, the rationalists should try to prescribe indigenous lifestyle to Western cultures, not the other way. Indigenous skills, knowledge, and information are accumulated and developed over the millennia based on long-term experience of the successes and failures of particular methods. Research has revealed that through indigenous knowledge of food production, people are better able to feed themselves than if they have scientific interference from outside. Indigenous knowledge of farming and forestry maintains biodiversity than the mechanized type of farming. In other words, change is required in Western cultures while indigenous cultures continue to live unchanged as they lived for millennia. We need a new purpose in life which is different from the ideology of high living standards for everyone. This new purpose could be termed trusteeship or stewardship and elegant simplicity for everyone. United Nations should operate on moral ground, not on capitalism ground. If United Nations gives priority to justice, morality, and ethics, it would simply identify the danger, pass the necessary laws, and get on with eliminating fossil fuels. But for various reasons, both good and bad, no such infrastructure exists. We must address climate change danger with a very complex and cumbersome international system we have, where almost 200 countries must first achieve some national consensus on policy and then build a global consensus for action on that shaky foundation. In other words, United Nations should show more aggressive pursuit on moral ground if they operate on justice, moral and ethical foundation, not lulling people into a false sense of confidence that something is being done. Climate change is unique. It raises numbers of hard security problems and it has no hard security solutions at all. In fact, the only solution it has is cooperation. It takes real maturity to do cooperation. If we miss cooperation, the climate takes over itself and all we have got left is adaptation, which will be brutal, ugly. The politics is what slows it down and screws it up. But no big thing can be done in the human world without a great deal of consciousness and moral ground. We need to inject idealism, ethics, and morality into our system. Only then can we create a social and economic system which is fair and just. Unfortunately, at present, our emphasis is on the economy and material wealth. The eternal values are secondary. This needs to be the other way around. Western cultures should choose poverty, hunger, compassion, simplicity, and humility to bring equilibrium to the earth. They are not only options, but they should be choices. They should become choices for a sustainable future. This could bring a sacred balance to a dying planet, which is already facing imbalance due to environmental crisis. Our attitude towards poverty, hunger, weeping needs a radical change. We should see them as blessings, not as curses or something to be wiped out. They are elements of keeping a balance in the earth. The moment our attitude changes, everything will start to change. The right attitude will produce right relationship and also right language. Focusing on affluence, on accumulating more and more possessions, and on thinking that being rich is the status symbol, such a mindset will corrupt our actions and our lives. But if the focus is on creativity, on human relationships, on beauty and aesthetics, on arts and culture, on community and spirituality, then money is of lesser importance. It has to begin with a change of heart and a change of attitudes. Another thing bugging me is the imposing market economy on the consumers. This is the consumption intensive civilization built mainly on the availability of plentiful and cheap products. In a global market economy, decisions are increasingly made by centralized economic and political institutions which show little concern for the consequences of their actions on local communities. Transnational corporations, by definition, do not belong to any country. Ultimately, there is no effective democratic means of controlling their activities. International development and trade institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and World Trade Organization reflect the interest of global markets more than they do the interest of local communities. Both wealth and power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of the global capitalist elite, often at the expense of average citizens in both the developed and developing countries. Moreover, markets do not provide what we really need, but they create unlimited new needs and fuel greed. Though United Nations and Western rationalists wishfully discourage consumers not to buy, in the context of the global market economy, goods are produced not for those who need them, but rather for those who have the money to buy them. Rather than convincing 200 leaders of the states not to produce, United Nations and Western rationalists try to convince 7 billion people not to consume them. That's a pity. If you can't convince 200 people, how are you going to convince 7 billion? United Nations and Western rationalists perhaps can persuade state leaders not to manufacture certain products such as plastic, dangerous drugs, dangerous electronics, chemicals, DDT, and other harmful substances that continue to cause damage to the planet. Negotiating such a deal at a global level, with everybody included, will be the easiest political enterprise ever taken. Just convince only 200 people. So instead of convincing those 200 leaders of the states, we are running after 7 billion people. Change your heart and change your lifestyle, change your habit. All we need to change only 200 leaders to change their lifestyle and their habit. With them, the other 7 billion people, their life is easy. They are going to change anyway. And thank you, and you all have a nice evening. Good night.